3 million years out in deep space, a dilapidated mining ship drifts pointlessly round in a huge, aimless circle. On board are its 4 crew members. Dave Lister, technician 3rd class and the last human being alive. Rimmer, a hologram of Dave's dead bunkmate. Crichton, a service mechanoid. And Cat, a humanoid creature evolved from cats. They sit in a horseshoe trapped in the ultimate computer game, a game that plugs directly into the brain and enables them to experience a world created by their own fantasies. The game is called Better Than Life, and very few ever escape its thrall. Very few can give up their own personally sculpted paradise. Rimmer sat on the open terrace in his half-devastated dinner suit of the night before and gazed down at the metallic blue time machine drunkenly parked skew-whiff in the ornamental gardens of the Palace of Versailles. Breakfasting with him were 5 of his stag night companions: John F. Kennedy, Vincent van Gogh, Albert Einstein, Louis XVI, and Elvis Presley.
"That was a heck of a night,"
Kennedy sparkled.
"One heck of a night."
And he was right. As bachelor night parties went, it had been a bit of a cracker. He couldn't remember the order, but at one point they had definitely dropped in on one of Caligula's orgies. Rimmer must have been fairly drunk by then, because he remembered spending at least 20 minutes trying to chat up a horse. A heck of a night. Rimmer looked at his real-time watch.
"Well, Louis, me old buckaroo, we'd better be making tracks. Big kissy-kissy to Marie and the Dauphin. Thanks for the servant, girls. See you at the wedding."
Rimmer gingerly made his way across the lawns towards the timecopter, followed by Kennedy, Van Gogh, Einstein, and Caesar. Elvis crammed a steak in his mouth, stuffed a second in his pocket, grabbed 4 bread rolls, and followed them. Sparkling lights looped from tree to tree along the main street. A small brass band umparred discordant but cheery carols in the town square as last-minute shoppers slushed through the snow, exchanging seasonal greetings and stopping occasionally to join in a favourite carol. In the fictional town of Bedford Falls, it was Christmas Eve. But then again, in the fictional town of Bedford Falls, it was always Christmas Eve. Lister crossed the main street, his 2 sons perched on either shoulder, and headed for the toy shop. As they passed the jailhouse, Bert the cop was removing a wanted poster from the front window. There hadn't been a single crime in Bedford Falls for over 30 years. Lister slid the twins from his shoulders and grasped their tiny hands as the 2 4-year-olds gazed mouths ajar at the large blue sailing boat on sale for $2.25 in the toy shop window. Suddenly, the door jangled open, and old Mr. Mulligan appeared in the doorway.
"Now then, me lads, would I be correct in thinking you'll be after doing business with me in respect of a certain sailing vessel?"
"Yes, sir, we are, sir,"
said Bexley.
"We've been saving up all year. Show 'em the money, Jim."
Jim took out his spider box.
"Here it is, sir, $2.25.
As old Mr. Mulligan held out the boat, Henry, the town down-and-out, shuffled sadly by. He took a futile swig from a bottle concealed in a brown paper bag and threw it in a waste bin.
"Merry Christmas, gentlemen."
Jim gazed up at his stubble-swathed face.
"Where are you spending Christmas, Mr. Henry?"
"Well, that's a very good question. Being this out of jailhouse is closed for the Yuletide period, and the Bel Air Hotel Presidential Suite is fully booked, it looks like the park bench Hilton for old Henry."
"What are you going to eat?"
"Don't worry about me, boy. I always share a fine Christmas dinner with the ducks up on Potter's Pond."
The twins turned and faced each other. Finally they both nodded, and Bexley turned back to Henry and held out his hand.
"Me and Jim would like you to have this, Mr. Henry. Merry Christmas. You can get a room at old Ma Bailey's boarding house and have a proper Christmas like the rest of us."
Henry's bloodshot eyes filled with tears.
Well, now, you'd be giving me your Christmas money.
Lister looked down at his feet.
Deep down, you're a really good person. You just got sad when old Mrs. Henry went to heaven.
Henry blubbed. What would my Mary say if she could see me now? She'd give me such a talking to. My ears would be ringing for a week.
No, she wouldn't, Mr. Henry.
Bexley shook his head.
She'd say you brought up 2 fine children single-handed and sent them both to college. You only took to the bottle when the angels had to take them away too.
Lister snuffled and whimpered and accepted Mulligan's handkerchief. Henry bent down and pressed the money back into Jim's hand.
I can't take this from you boys, but if I could just borrow $1 to get myself a haircut and a shave, there's a sweeping job going down at the drugstore.
Jim and Bexley smiled.
Merry Christmas, Mr. Henry.
Jim folded the single dollar bill around the 25 cents and placed it carefully back into his spider box.
Come on, Dad. Let's go back home.
Wait,
called Mulligan.
have I told you about me winter sale just this minute started? Take, for instance, this fine blue boat, formerly $2.25, now reduced to $1.25.
He handed the boat to the boys. Lister started sobbing unashamedly, which set Henry off. The 2 men embraced one another and were soon joined by old Mr. Mulligan and Bert the cop. They stood there in a 4-way hug, bawling hysterically. This was the kind of thing that happened all the time in the fictional town of Bedford Falls. It was that kind of place. The 12-wheeled juggernaut hammered down the narrow country lane, decapitating hedgerows and smashing through branches as it lurched on and off the road. Its air horn sounded as it dragged round a tight bend and straightened out too soon, ripping through a picket fence and flattening a metal road sign. Welcome to Bedford Falls, it said. Population 3,241. Very soon, the information on the sign would be hopelessly inaccurate. The 5-piece brass band staggered its way through God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. Almost the entire population of Bedford Falls stood around the giant Christmas tree in the town square, their sweet, discordant voices drifting up into the evening sky. Lister, with Bexley and Jim on his shoulders again, was sandwiched between Mr. Mulligan and Henry. Henry, with his freshly shaven face and his bristling new haircut, sang louder than anyone. Across the street, the door of 220 Sycamore Avenue opened, and Christine Kachansky ran over to join them, clutching a bag of hot-roasted chestnuts. She flashed her famous smile, the smile that made her face light up like a pinball machine awarding a bonus game, the smile Lister had fallen in love with. Suddenly, over the crest of the hill that led down to the main street, the dazzle of 8 huge headlights glared down towards them. Lister squinted against the glare and made out the shape of a road juggernaut. It was out of control and heading straight for the carol-singing crowd in the town square. Arnold Rimmer, the richest man in the world, gazed down from the balcony windows of his colonial mansion at the blur of black-suited waiters who dashed frantically about with increasingly elaborate flower arrangements, while an army of pastry chefs put the finishing touches to the wedding cake, which featured as its centerpiece an Olympic-sized swimming pool full of vintage champagne. A bespectacled man in a brown tweed suit quivered obsequiously at the door.
It's all ready, sir. Shall I bring it through?
Rimmer nodded.
If you'd just like to slip out of that one, we'll see how it feels.
Rimmer pressed the release catch concealed in his navel, and with a whoosh, his essence floated out of his body. Rimmer changed his body more often than most people had a haircut. Every time he detected the slightest wrinkle or sign of wear, he'd trade it in for a brand-new model. And why not? Out there in reality, he didn't have a body. He was a hologram. This place certainly had the edge over reality. Here he was a god, and everything was perfect. Well, almost everything. Still, that was behind him now. Juanita Chicata was history. The much-publicized court case dragged on for months. Preposterously, the Brazilian bombshell had denied adultery, and Rimmer's lawyers had been forced to parade Juanita's ex-lovers through the witness stand. It took 5 days. The alimony agreement had been of historical magnitude. In fact, it would have been cheaper for Rimmer to support the entire population of Bolivia in perpetuity, but it was worth every single naught to get that crazy, dangerous, gorgeous woman out of his life. Helen couldn't have been more different. No berserk, china-hurling tantrums for her. No satanic, knife-wielding charges at his naked person. No embarrassing, bellowed arguments in humiliatingly expensive restaurants. No. Dear, sensible Helen, with her short, sensible legs, her thick, sensible ankles, and her sturdy, sensible underpants. Rimmer thought with a shudder about Juanita's underwear. Ghostly threads of spun black silk that stretched wickedly across her flat brown belly. You could have swallowed her entire lingerie collection without needing a glass of water. If Rimmer had thought about it, he might have asked himself why, in a landscape moulded by his own mind, Juanita existed at all. The truth of it was, his psyche just didn't like him. Better Than Life operated on an entirely subliminal level. It wasn't possible, for instance, to wish for a turbocharged Harley-Davidson, and blip, it appeared. The secret to BTL's addictive quality was that it gave the players things they didn't even know they desired by tapping their subconscious minds. Which was all very well so long as you weren't a total psychological screw-up. Unfortunately, Rimmer was. Subconsciously, Rimmer felt he was worthless. He didn't deserve success, and he certainly didn't deserve happiness. What he deserved was punishment. Punishment and misery. And Better Than Life wasn't about to disappoint him. The carved ivory phone purred into life on the Louis XV writing bureau. Rimmer waited his customary 20 rings before he strode over to the desk and picked up the receiver. It wasn't much of a conversation from Rimmer's point of view. All he said was, "What?" 5 times. The first "what" was a flat, evenly delivered inquiry. The second was a mixture of incredulity and amusement. The third was loud and angry. The fourth was screeched and hysterical, and the fifth sad, quiet, and resigned. He replaced the receiver gently in its cradle, then rolled his body into a ball and began moaning quietly on the bed. Knock! The cat leant heavily in the saddle, his left hand firmly gripping the leathery neck of his gigantic brontosaurus as it galloped downfield toward the unguarded goal. His mallet arced up in the air and flashed briefly in the sunlight before sweeping deftly down and blasting the small furry creature between the 2 white posts. Goal! Ow! Creature polo was the cat's favorite game. Unnecessary cruelty to small furry animals was very much part of his psychological makeup. Plus he got to dress up in some really neat duds. A huge-bosomed Valkyrie, dressed in scanty armour, reined in her Triceratops and patted the cat on the back. "Nice goal. Great stick work." The cat flashed his perfect teeth and wiggled an eyebrow.
Baby, my stick work is always great.
2 furry creatures and a personal hat-trick later, the cat stood in the shade of the marquee's green awning sipping a celebratory goblet of milk while one of his army of Valkyries noisily performed an indecent act on his body. The cat sighed. What a nice day he was having. Mechanoids weren't supposed to have desires and longings, but Crichton did. Originally, he'd entered the game to rescue the others. He was a sanitation mechanoid, programmed to clean, and in theory, should have been immune to the game's lure, but he wasn't. In theory, leaving Better Than Life was simple. All the player had to do was to want to leave. All the player had to do was to imagine an exit and pass through it back to reality. Crichton had imagined his gateway easily enough, but as he was about to pass under the pink neon exit sign, a cafeteria materialized to his right. In the window was a handwritten card which read, "Dishwasher wanted." The cafeteria was deserted, but in the kitchen, stacked ceiling high, were several huge towers of dirty dishes piled around a sink.
"Oh, I'll just wash a few," he thought. "Reduce the pile a bit."
8 months later, still washing, still surrounded by stacks of dirty dishes, he'd realized he'd been duped. The game had found his innermost desire, and he'd scurried off ashamed. Mechanoids weren't supposed to have desires. Back in the 21st century, as robotic life became more and more sophisticated, it was generally accepted that something was needed to keep the droids in check. For the most part, they were stronger and often more intelligent than human beings. Why should they submit to a lifetime of drudgery and service? Many of them didn't. Many of them rebelled. Then it occurred to a bright young systems analyst at Android International that the best way to keep the robots subdued was to give them religion. The concept of silicon heaven was born. A belief chip was implanted in the motherboard of every droid that now came off the production line. Almost everything with a hint of artificial intelligence was programmed to believe that silicon heaven was the electronic afterlife, the final resting place for the souls of all electrical equipment. At last they had solace. They were every bit as exploited as they'd always been, but now they believed there was some kind of justice at the end of it all. Crichton believed in silicon heaven. Of course, he'd heard rumours that all machines were programmed to hold this belief, but as far as he was concerned, that was nonsense. For was it not written in the electronic Bible, authorized Panasonic version?
And some will come among ye, and yea, from their mouths shall come doubts. But turn ye from them, heed them not. For it is harder for a droid who disbelieveth to pass through the gates of silicon heaven than it is for a din-to-din coaxial cable to connect up to a standard European SCART socket.
Mechanoids shouldn't have fantasies, not if they wanted to get into silicon heaven. Crichton genuflected the sign of the crossed circuit and stumbled up the path towards the cat's golden towered castle. He was going to make amends. He was going to rescue them all from their paradise. The air horn thundered into the night air as the 12-wheeled juggernaut slewed sideways across the ice into Bedford Falls' main street. The revelling carolers stood like a waxwork tableau as the giant tank had jackknifed into an uncontrollable skid and slammed through Mulligan's window, showering the street with teddy bears, dolls, and lethal shards of glass. Next, it took out the entire ground floor of Ma Bailey's boarding house before caroming through Ernie's gas station, uprooting the single pump and sending raw gasoline pulsing over the forecourt. A spark from the juggernaut's fender caught the spreading pool, and a pretty orange mushroom thumped into the night sky. And still on it went, this juggernaut from hell, demolishing everything in its path. Lister watched helplessly as it sliced through the giant Christmas tree. The impact flicked the truck's cab onto its side, and it twisted free of the trailer, before slithering across the main street, and finally coming to rest in the sitting room of Lister's home, 220 Sycamore Avenue. Lister stood in the crowd, clutching Kachansky and the twins, and watched as the cab door opened. A leg in a laddered fishnet stocking hooked itself over the side of the upended cab, followed by some peroxide blonde hair. The woman jumped to the ground and staggered in her 8-inch stiletto heels over the rubble towards the dumbstruck crowd.
Is everyone okay? My heel got stuck under the air brake.
She tugged pointlessly at her ludicrously short black rubber skirt and tried to rearrange her bosom so that at least 30% of her mighty breasts remained inside her tight red bolero.
Bloody things,
she muttered.
Is this Bedford Falls?
Bert the cop stepped forward.
It was, lady.
He held out his hand.
You got any ID, ma'am?
ID? I know for a fact that I have my name tattooed on my backside. If I show you that, will you forget this ID business? There's someone I've got to talk to. It's really important.
And who might that be?
A guy called Dave Lister.
The entire population of Bedford Falls turned and looked at Lister.
That's me,
he said unnecessarily. Kochanski smiled at him coldly.
Look, I've never seen this woman before in my life.
Lister pushed through the throng and headed towards the blonde who was now seated on the road, rubbing the ball of her right foot and complaining that prostitution was murder on the feet. She looked up. Recognition flashed across her features.
Hi, do I know you? You might say that.
Lister turned to protest his innocence to Kochanski. She wasn't there. She was halfway across the street, scarlet-faced with the twins in tow.
Chrissy! Wait!
But she was gone. A thought occupied Rimmer's mind that had no verbal form. He still couldn't believe it. He stared at the ivory telephone as if it were somehow responsible for what had happened. He staggered across to the balcony windows and gazed again on the elaborate wedding preparations. He was wiped out, broke, finished. And no one who was wiped out, broke and finished can afford a $30 million wedding.
Arnold?
His brother Frank was knocking politely on the open door.
Wanted little word before the big event.
Rimmer swung round. Rimmer's whole life had been one long sprint to get out of Frank's shadow, and only here, in Better Than Life, had it proved possible. As his corporation cracked time travel, as he opened his chains of time stores and body swaps and became a multi-billionaire, as he captured the heart of Juanita, Rimmer adored having Frank around so he could force-feed him his success, triumph by triumph, in large, indigestible chunks. The bankruptcy news would change all that, of course. Rimmer's failure would slide down Frank's throat like oysters washed down with chilled Chablis.
What is it?
Helen. A bit concerned that you're sort of jumping in on the rebound from Juanita.
You'd love that, wouldn't you?
Rimmer thought.
Well, I'm not,
He said out loud.
I've no more feeling for Juanita than I do for the smoked kippers I ate for breakfast last Thursday. She, like them, is out of my system.
How would you feel if Juanita shacked up with someone else?
Look, Frank, me old buckaroo, Juanita can paddle to hell in a slop bucket for all I care. She's no longer part of my life. Helen is everything I want. She's so...
Sensible?
Yes,
said Rimmer, suddenly weary.
sensible.
Good. I'm happy for you, and I hope you'll be happy for me.
Why should I be happy for you?
That's what I've been trying to tell you. Juanita and I, we're sort of an item. Early days, but...
There was a long silence. Ice ages came and went. Planets formed and died. Then someone laughed, using his vocal cords. Then Rimmer heard his own voice.
Oh, Frank, that's wonderful. I couldn't be more pleased.
Really? You mean it?
No, you fat fart.
Rimmer's mind screamed.
Of course I don't smegging mean it.
Yes, absolutely. It's marvellous news. Is she here? Is she coming today?
She's at a hotel down the road. We couldn't bear to be apart. But heavens, no, she wouldn't dream of intruding on your wedding.
They couldn't bear to be apart? For one afternoon? Rimmer looked at Frank. He had that pinkish glow of the newly in love. It made Rimmer want to kill him. Someone was using Rimmer's vocal cords again.
Invite her, please. Truly, Helen and I will be offended if you don't.
Really?
Absolutely.
Meanwhile, back in reality, Holly was getting worried. Strange things can happen to a computer left alone for 3 million years, and something strange had happened to Holly. He'd become computer senile. He no longer had the IQ of 300 Einsteins. He had the IQ of a single all-night car park attendant. And now the crew were trapped in Better Than Life and showed no sign of ever returning. He was alone yet again. He had to get a companion, someone to keep him sane. But who? There was no one else on the ship. The Scutters, the claw-headed 2-feet-high service droids who glided around on motorized bases, were very little use. They had no speech capability. Then, From a rusting rhomboard in a cobwebby recess deep in the furthermost reaches of his huge, decrepit data retrieval system, a memory sparked and spluttered. It was an idea of his own. Holly hadn't seen one for some considerable time. This was Holly's idea. What about the toaster? Lister's toaster. It was an idea that would cost Holly his life.
Red Dwarf, Better Than Life was written by Grant Naylor and performed by Chris Barry. Additional music and effects were by Nick Graham. Technical presentation by John Etchells. Produced by Chris Wallace.